I've put the 4 periods of Rus history on the board, or 4 eras, to just remind us of the chronological framework. And we're effectively still in this period of disintegration in terms of our chronological development. In the middle of this period is the date 1169, because it is, as I mentioned when we were discussing the era of disintegration, a symbolic milestone, because it was in that year when a prince from the north, Andrei Bogoliubskii, sent his son with a large contingent of troops from where he ruled up in the north in Vladimir-Suzdal. If we look at this map up here, the symbolic center of the Rus realm, Kyiv. Now, not only was this quite extraordinary, harsh treatment directed against the mother of the Rus cities, not only was it exceptional in the history of Rus, even more telling was the fact that Andrei Bogoliubskii, and I will put his name up here, in Vladimir-Suzdal, he decided not only to, effective, if you will, bring Kyiv under his control, but he decided not to make Kyiv, the city, his capital, princely residence, but rather the city of Vladimir in the northern province of Vladimir-Suzdal. That is in the north. This was a clear indication that by the late 12th century, hence this symbolic date of 1169, Kyiv had begun to lose its charisma as the magnet around which all Rus princes had previously revolved. Clearly, this was an indication of coming profound changes which were in the making in Eastern Europe. And yet, despite the brutal destruction of the city of Kyiv by Bogoliubskii, life in Kyiv soon returned to normal. A new prince of Kyiv, Sviatoslav, who came from the neighboring principality of Chernihiv, reigned there from 1176 to 1194, so a relative almost 20 years. Rival princes from among Bogoliubskii's successors up there in the north in Vladimir-Suzdal, and also from Galicia in the west. Both of them from the north and the west tried to extend their respective spheres of influence over the traditional political and cultural capital of the realm of Rus. And so nothing new. Things were normal in Rus history. This rivalry between the Rus princes provoked further conflicts, wars, which of course we know had become so characteristic of the history of Rus. In a sense, all of Kyiv's interprincely wars could be viewed as but a reflection of deep-seated economic and regional rivalries between the various cities or the residences of the various princes of the Rus realm, that is, the princes with their rich merchants, and the principalities as a whole, with their rulers and boyar retainers. The boyars, as we saw last time, being those landowners. And in the absence of any strong, charismatic senior prince in Kiev or grand prince, these centrifugal forces prevailed throughout the Kievan realm. And then, of course, never to forget, there was that ever-present danger posed by the nomadic peoples. The nomadic peoples on the open steppe. The Polovtsians that we have heard about, certainly during our late third and period, and even slightly before, they had been quiet since the rule of Volodymyr Monomakh, that is at least up until the beginning of the 12th century, 1113. He was one of those major charismatic figures during the period of consolidation. But in the 1160s, notice 1169, Bogoliubskii comes from the north, at the same time down on the steppes, under the Polovtsians, under their leader of a dynamic Khan named Konchak, Khan Konchak, 1160s. Under his leadership, the Polovtsians begin to renew their attacks, certainly against the southern Rus principalities, Pereyaslavl, Chernihiv, Novhorod-Siversky, eventually the province of Kiev as well. And in fact, it was from this very period that one of the local princes, Prince Ihor, in Novhorod-Siversky, which is just southeast of Kiev, a kind of borderland province to the open steppe. This was the ruler at the time who figures in the 1185 expedition. This actually took place against the Polovtsians, and that was immortalized in that literary work that I discussed last time, The Lay of Prince Ihor's Campaign. After the death of this Khan Konchak in 1187, so he was around for a good almost three decades. And because of the Polovtsian interest farther westward, in Bulgaria, on the doorsteps of the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire, many Polovtsians who remained in the steppe followed the lead of their Turkic predecessors, that is the Pechenegs and the Turks, and they began to live in good relations, one could say peace, and even close political and dynastic cooperation, including intermarriage with the Rus princes. So the Polovtsians became a kind of stabilizing force now on the steppe. Having said this, by the first decades of the 13th century, the 1200s, it seemed as though this extensive realm of Rus may have been on its way to entering a new era, during which the traditional external threat posed by the steppe peoples, in this case the Polovtsians, was overcome, and the realm of Rus would continue, even if the political hegemony nominally exercised by the city of Kyiv would be replaced by three other centers: Galicia-Volhynia in the far west, Novgorod in the far north, and Vladimir-Suzdal in the northeast. Now, whether a political balance could have been worked out by these three centers, whether they could have formulated a new economic order based primarily on agriculture. We discussed the kind of economic evolution last time between trade and agriculture. To do so in response to those changing international patterns of international commerce, whether all the Rus lands would have been reunited, or would the south, under the leadership of Galicia-Volhynia, and the north, under the leadership of Vladimir-Suzdal and Novgorod, be able to survive independently as political entities. All of these questions do provide interesting material for later-day historians and other intellectuals who enjoy reflecting on what might have happened if such or such another event had not taken place. Now, while this kind of speculation, what today is frequently referred to as counterfactual or counterintuitive history, may or may not be intellectually rewarding, the fact remains that a critical event did take place. An event which was to change unalterably the direction of Eastern European history. And that event was the Mongol invasion. The Mongol invasion. Ever since the outset of our course, we have seen how the early history of developments on the present territory of Ukraine seem to be characterized by a repetitive sequence of events, a sequence of events marked by nomadic invasions in which one warrior people arrived from the east, sometimes from the north, pushed out its predecessor, and then after a certain period of time, that new nomadic people was pushed out and replaced by another. And so we have that long list of somewhat exotic and strange-sounding peoples who, people's names at least, who since the second millennium before the Common Era have left their traces upon Ukraine. Sumerians, Scythians, Sarmatians, Alans, Goths, Huns, Avars, Bulgars, Khazars, Magyars, Pechenegs, Polovtsians. The last of the nomads from the east were the Mongols. After their arrival in the first half of the 13th century, the 1200s, it was these Mongols who were to determine the political fortunes of all of Eastern Europe for the next 2 centuries. And it was their political descendants who were to control large parts of Ukraine, particularly the Crimea, Black Sea coast, and its hinterland, until as late as the 17th century. So who were these Mongols? They were a nomadic people who, as their name suggests, originated in Mongolia. In 1206, a local tribal leader named Temujin he succeeded in having all of the tribes in Mongolia to submit to his absolute authority and to swear allegiance to him as the new emperor, or in their language, Khan. And he became known in history as the Severe One, or the Great, that is the Genghis Khan. The Genghis Khan. Until his death in 1227, so we're in the first decades of the 13th century, this Genghis Khan conquered northern China, then moving westward, all of Asia, north of the Himalaya Mountains, modern-day Afghanistan, Turkestan, Persia, Iran, the Caucasus kingdoms. His tactics and those of his generals and early successes were of the fiercest kind, often accompanied by brutality, death, material destruction. In that sense, certainly in Western sources, Genghis Khan has been regarded as one of the quote-unquote scourges of humanity. He's seen as the personification of 12 centuries of attacks against the ancient sedentary civilizations by nomads of the steppe. Doesn't make a difference where those civilizations are. Most of them were in Central Asia. Indeed, none of his predecessors left so terrifying a reputation. And in fact, he made terror a system of government and massacre a deliberate and methodical institution. This is the kind of traditional view of Genghis Khan. But at the same time, he is also praised for success in bringing about eventual peace and stability to a large part of Asia. And in that sense, he created another one of these paxes, disorders that we've been speaking about, the Pax Romana, the Pax Scythica, the Pax Khazarica, and now we have the Pax Mongolica. The Pax Mongolica. Of course, even if it was done at frightful human cost. Now, it was not Genghis Khan, but rather his generals and later descendants who made their appearance in Eastern and Central Europe. And it was they who later ruled large parts of the region. In the millennial tradition of other nomads from the East, the Mongols came first to, in the case of Eastern Europe, the steppes of southern Russia, and in particular, Ukraine. After having conquered the Central Asian empires that were east of the Caspian Sea, both maps out here, two Mongol generals, Yebe and Subotai, less important, the names themselves, but it was two generals, were sent with a small army farther west on an expeditionary visit into the steppe region of southern Russia and Ukraine. You can see that the Mongols don't do things quickly. They do it very planned, very systematically. So they just send out this expeditionary force, and they reach the steppe. And who was in the steppe? The Polovtsians. They're a Turkic people. Many of the soldiers that are fighting under the Mongols are in fact Turkic peoples that they pick up in Central Asia. Polovtsians find out real quickly. They're terrified that these scourge is coming from the east. They turn to their recently acquired allies, the Rus princes, and specifically of Chernihiv and Kiev. And so these princes from Chernihiv, Kiev, together with the princes of Galicia and Smolensk, the Rus gather an army of 80,000. that marches southward toward the Sea of Azov. And there on a little stream that flows into the Sea of Azov, not far from Melitopol, it's called the River Kalka. The River Kalka. There, the combined Rus-Polovtsian force was met in 1223 by this Mongol expeditionary force, and the Rus are totally routed. The Prince of Galicia and the Polovtsians were forced to flee. The senior prince of Kyiv was captured, allowed an honorary surrender, but then he and all his men were killed. This first disaster on the Kalka River had no immediate consequences because after raiding the southern Pereyaslav Principality, going down into Crimea, capturing one of the Black Sea ports, Soldaia or Sudak, the Mongol expeditionary force had carried out its goal, and it returns to Mongolia. The devastated Rus princes and their Polovtsian allies were given a kind of now respite. The Mongols left. They came. Within a couple of months, went back home. But this respite was short. In 1237, the Mongols return. This time they lead a larger army, composed mainly of Central Asian Turkic peoples that they previously subjected. And those larger army with all those Turkic peoples, the chronicles referred to them as Tatars. They weren't all Tatars, but this was the term that was used. So now we have Mongol leadership and Tatar troops. This Mongolo-Tatar force was under the leadership of the grandson of the Genghis Khan, the great Khan, and his name was Batu. Batu. And here, again, the dates are 1237, when they arrive, 1238. Batu, the leader, why? Because the Mongols had already divided up their understanding of the world, which was, for all intents and purposes, almost from the Pacific through all of Asia to Europe. And the western portion of this now large sphere was given to Batu. He was accompanied by one of those generals that had met the Mongols a decade before, or 2 decades before almost, at the River Kalka. This time, the returning Mongols decided to strike first in the north. They entered those northeastern Rus principalities of Vladimir-Suzdal, and right next to it, Ryazan. And you can see these arrows here, which trace the route of the Mongols. First, they go to the Upper Volga, they destroy the Volga Bulgars, and then they enter Rus territory, again, as I said, in Ryazan, and then Vladimir-Suzdal. And so beginning in December 1237, at the very end of the year, and into the spring of 1238, when the ground is frozen and when it's easier to move. Winter's a good time for fighting, especially if you have horse-drawn troops or horse-led troops. And so one after another, these cities fall. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Tver, the smallest of them a place called Moscow. So this is the early spring of now 1238, and then the Mongols decide to move southward and to rest for the next 2.5 years, and they do so on the steppe grasslands of Ukraine, known at the time as the steppe of the Kipchaks. Why the steppe of the Kipchaks? Because the Kipchaks is just the Turkic name for Polovtsian. And the Polovtsians, this was their steppe traditionally. As for those Polovtsians or Kipchaks who were there, some were pressed into Mongol military service. Others sought refuge among the Rus to the north, along the Ros River in particular. Still others fled westward, eventually settling across the Carpathian Mountains in what is in the Hungarian kingdom, which is more or less present-day Hungary. Now, with the Polovtsian presence neutralized or eliminated, the Mongols now could turn to the Rus cities in Ukraine. They had already eliminated many of the power in the north and now in southern Rus. In 1240, and note 1240 is the classic date here that ends our period of disintegration. In 1240, they began their offensive, first attacking the southern Rus principalities of Chernihiv and Pereyaslav, that is both south and just southeast and just northeast of Kyiv. They do this in the summer of 1240, and then in early December 1240, the Mongols attacked Kyiv. After a few days of desperate resistance, the city fell on December 6th. Its survivors were slain and the city largely destroyed. The Mongols then moved on farther westward, laying waste to parts of Volhynia and Galicia in the west. And it was there that the Mongols split into two forces. Some, they're in Galicia-Volhynia. Some go north into what is present-day Poland. In fact, it was only in Poland that the only time the Mongols were defeated, at a small town called Legnica in the southwestern, modern-day southwestern Poland. So some of them go north, and then others cross the Carpathians, and they go into Hungary. They destroy the Hungarian, the king and the Hungarian kingdom, and then they move along the Dalmatian coast by 1242. But then, while they are there, in the spring of 1242, Batu, who's leading these forces, suddenly decides to return to Mongolia. Why? Because the Supreme Khan had died, and so now he is thinking that he may become the Supreme Khan, the successor to his grandfather Genghis. And so those Mongol armies start back hurriedly to the east. They cross Romania, modern-day Romania, Bulgaria, again across the Black Sea, past the lower Volga River, and here they are leaving, and they are now returning. And on the way, returning back to Mongolia, near the mouth of the Volga River, not far from where the Khazars had traditionally their political center, political and economic center. There on the lower Volga, the Mongols set up an administrative capital for their western lands, if you will, called Saray. Saray, right near the mouths of the great Volga river. This was to be the administrative center of their possessions in Eastern Europe. And what did they call this new portion of their large sphere or Mongol Empire? They named it after those who they destroyed, which is quite typical, actually. And they called it the Kipchak Khanate. That is the Khanate of the Kipchaks. That is the Polovtsians. In East Slavic and also in Western European sources, this Kipchak Khanate came to be known as the Golden Horde. The Golden Horde. This Golden Horde, Mongol Golden Horde, was to keep the northern principalities of Rus in direct or indirect subjugation for 2.5 centuries, and the southern Rus principalities for even longer. Each Rus prince, no matter how strong he may have been, had until as late as 1480, the late 15th century, to submit himself to the Golden Horde and to pay an annual tribute. If a prince rebelled, he and his lands incurred invasion and certain destruction at the hands of the Mongol armies. But on the other hand, if the Rus princes paid their taxes and their tribute to the Mongols and paid their obeisance, which means when you go to the Khan or the Mongol ruler, in particular the Khan, you bow down and you beat your head on the ground, very symbolic and very important. And if you did this, then you're left alone. And so despite the ferocity of Genghis Khan and his generals in the lands that were being conquered during their era of expansion, in the end, the Mongols were not interested in transforming Kyiv-Rus into a wasteland. Even the descriptions of the physical destruction of Rus cities during that winter of 1237, 1240, early 41, in many cases, that destruction was exaggerated by the chronicles. Why? Because in essence, in Kyiv-Rus, life returned pretty much to what it had been before the appearance of the Mongols. For instance, the Orthodox Rus Church was left alone. And by the way, its hierarchs frequently expressed gratitude to the Khans. And in circumstances where no one Rus prince was allowed to increase his authority without the permission of the Mongols, orthodoxy remained for some time the most important unifying factor in what was now a politically fragmented Rus realm. It's also interesting to note that in the southern Rus lands, that is in Ukraine, as well in the north, by the way, many peasants and small artisans in the cities willingly subjected themselves to the Mongols. After all, the Mongols promised peace and stability in return for this annual payment in grain and other goods. And they delivered on their promise. And for many peasants and artisans, this was a welcome change from what they had known. Interprincely wars, constant raids by nomads that we saw mark the last centuries of Kyiv-Rus. So now we have order, albeit under the Pax Mongolica. Usually this lecture occurs sometime around October 10th. And October 10th I don't think it was, well, it was certainly never a statutory holiday in Canada, but in the United States it was recognized as Columbus Day. And Columbus obviously originally came from Italy, though he was in the service of Spain. Why do I mention that here? Because there's an Italianate period in the history of Ukraine, and now we are going to, near Columbus Day, talk about the Italianate era, if you will, in Ukraine. Sounds strange, but here you go. The Mongols and their Tatar soldiers and then administrators also continued the traditions followed by many of their nomadic predecessors, and we know previously settled north of the Black Sea, derived their wealth from international trade. In the case of the Mongols, their capital was this Saray on the near the mouth of the Volga River, and it became a major stop on the caravan routes from Central Asia and China, among them the famous Silk Route, or one version of the Silk Route. So it comes from Central Asia, it goes through Saray, and then it continues on a land route down to the Crimea in a place called Solkhat, and eventually the products reach the coast of the Black Sea coastal cities in Crimea. Realizing the value of these international trade routes, the Mongols then contributed to a revival of these coastal cities in Crimea. But this time, the leadership was not taken by the Mongols. I mean, after all, they're steppe people, and they're up in the north. They have other interests. And so it's turned over to whom, or allowed, by Italian or Italianate merchants from Venice, from Pisa, and most especially from Genoa in Liguria in northwestern Italy. In 1266, the Mongols allow the Genoese to build some warehouses at the old Bosporan port of Feodosiia, which is modern-day Feodosiia, along the Black Sea coast of Crimea. But here, under the Genoese, it became known as Caffa. Caffa. Within a few decades, Genoan, to a lesser degree Venetian influence, but they were there too, spread throughout the region. And so all of these old centers of the Bosporan kingdom, like Panticapaeum and Tanais, Tmutorakhan, etc., now they become Italian places named Vosporo, Tana, Matrega, Soldaia. Farther east, the Genoans controlled Cembalo, which is modern-day Balaclava, where the Soviets and the Russians still have their fleet. They revived the port of Bilhorod, the former Greek town of Tiras at the mouth of the Dniester River. It now becomes Italianate or Genoese Moncastro. All these cities became not only markets for international trade, but also centers of local manufacture and crafts. And the main center of this Black Sea trading network was the Genoese-controlled Caffa. Although inhabited just like other cities in the region, which was typical of Crimea, by a whole mixture of peoples, Armenians, Greeks, Slavs, Arabs, Vlachs, Karaites, Tatars. Caffa had all of these people, but it was administratively in the hands of a few Genoese trading companies. They were known as factories. and Genoese bankers who maintained good relations with the Byzantine Empire to the south and were directly linked to the economy thereby of their homeland city in the Western Mediterranean, Genoa. The most important local industry in Caffa was shipbuilding, but its greatest wealth was derived from control of the international trade in silks and spices from Central Asia, and later the more local trade in fish, grains, hides, and slaves, going back to the tradition. Where did they get this from? From the hinterland, the Ukrainian steppe hinterland, which came from those lands controlled by the Mongols. And then those products were brought on Genoese, to a lesser degree, Venetian ships to the Byzantine Empire, and from there into the Mediterranean Sea. Now, despite conflict from time to time, especially with the early Mongol rulers of the Golden Horde, by the second half of the 14th century, the late 1300s, Genoese influence had grown to such an extent that most of the Crimean Peninsula became a Genoese colony, which is known as in the sources as Gothia. Why Gothia? Well, the Goths were one of those peoples. The Goths accepted Christianity, and for some reason they named it Gothia. And to give you an idea of the Venetian influence, it would be hard to know where this typical European castle-like structure is built. I'll pass these around. But this typical Western European castle is in the Crimea, constructed by the Genoese. The point is that from the late 13th, that is the late 1200s, to the late 15th century, almost 2 centuries, this classic symbiotic relationship between the steppe hinterland and the coastal cities was reestablished, bringing about an era of stability to the eastern and southern Ukraine, this time under the hegemony of the Golden Horde and the Genoese. Now, as you might imagine, the Rus princes, boyars, those landowners, the clergy, rich merchants living farther to the north, did not necessarily welcome this new order in Eastern Europe. Why? Well, because this was an order in which the Rus were deprived of their former leading roles. For those articulate groups, the Mongol presence was described in terrible terms, dire terms, as the period of the Tatar yoke, which is still a phrase that's used when one studies the history of Eastern Europe. Moreover, many representatives of the ruling elite in Kyiv and other southern Rus cities of Ukraine did indeed flee northward or westward, where they were relatively further away from Mongol control. By the way, it was this exodus, known as a population transfer in Russian historical writings from the 19th century that we spoke about earlier in this course, made so much of by the Russian publicist Pogodin and by subsequent Russian historians in the 19th century. This exodus, everyone simply got up and left. Well, in fact, this transfer, or this exodus, consisted of only a small portion of Ukraine's Rus inhabitants, the elite. The vast majority remained behind, worked out a modus vivendi with the new Mongol order. In short, southern Rus or Ukraine was not depopulated of its Rus inhabitants after the Mongol invasion of 1240, 1241, or when it reached the Rus lands, southern Rus lands. And finally, in contrast to other parts of the vast Mongol Empire, whether it be China or Turkestan or Persia, the Mongols of the Golden Horde did not assimilate with the local Slavic population. Did not. One of the reasons was that the Mongols accepted Islam in the 1330s, and that put up a kind of well-defined barrier which remained between them and their Christian subjects. Now, despite its formidable military power, the Golden Horde was subject to the same kind of infighting between rival tribes, rival leaders. And by the way, that was also characteristic of the vast Mongol Empire since the days of Genghis Khan. In our case, during the second half of the 15th century, the late 1440s, the Golden Horde finally broke up, and leaving smaller groups of Tatar tribesmen who established states, successor states known as khanates, ruled by khans. And there were three of these khanates that developed out of the Golden Horde. You can see why I ask you not to sit so far away, because continually I have to hand out things. In any case, this is a unique map that shows these three khanates. The Kazan Khanate along the northern Volga River, the Astrakhan Khanate at the Volga's mouth, and the Crimean Khanate on the Volga Peninsula and the steppe north of the Sea of Azov. It is these three khanates that were to effectively interact and carry on the tradition of Mongolo-Tatar rule over large parts of Eastern Europe well into and up to at least the 18th century. And so to sum up today, this Mongol invasion of the mid-13th century and the subsequent establishment of the Kipchak Khanate, or the Golden Horde, ushered in a period of Eastern European history which came to be known in the sources, as I said, the Tatar yoke. We saw now how divisions within Rus, especially between the northern principalities led by Vladimir-Suzdal and the southern principalities led by Kiev, divisions which were symbolized by that sacking of Kiev that we started speaking about in 1169, all of that had already come about before the Mongol invasion. Any efforts to overcome those divisions or to preserve some sense of unity within the Rus realm, even if it would be between two power centers, this was now made impossible after 1240. In the face of the Mongol presence, no Rus principality, whether in the north or the south, could ever hope to restore the full extent of the Kievan political polity known as Rus. And whereas the old Rus principalities in the north continued a policy of unification, this time under the leadership of the princes and rulers of Vladimir, of Suzdal, and finally of Muscovy, the heritage of Kiev was to be preserved on the territory of Ukraine by the principalities of Galicia and Volhynia directly west of Kiev. And it is to that region, Galicia and Volhynia, and its particular history, both before